Welcome everyone. So my name is Manuel Martinez, and this is another episode of Career Downloads, where each episode I basically hit the refresh button, bring on a different guest to really learn more about their career and how they've managed it over time, to really be able to uncover any actionable advice that you can use as you're managing your own career. So for today's episode, I have with me Adam Lopez, and I had met him at a networking event. So this was for SIM, so the Society of Information Managers. We had connected on LinkedIn. I had seen his career path and found a lot of interest in kind of the trajectory that he had. So asked him to come on, and he more than graciously accepted. So with that, I'll introduce Adam.
Hey, thanks for having me, Manuel.
I appreciate you coming on and kind of sharing your career trajectory.
Absolutely.
So what I've been doing with my guests is if you just kind of give us a brief summary, just kind of tell us what your current position is and kind of some of the roles and responsibilities.
Yeah, sure. So currently I am the president of CMIT Solutions. We are a MSP cybersecurity company. So we predominantly do in the cybersecurity space, but we also do MSP, which is your help desk for small to medium-sized businesses. Typically our market is small to medium-sized businesses, but we also do government as well as enterprise, just depending on the level. We are a franchise that's been around since the 80s. Kind of funny story about the franchise. CMIT used to stand for Computer Moms in Informational Technology. So it was a mom that started the business, and she used to go around and fix people's computers. And so when I heard about the story, I love the story. I love the everything about that. And I was like, how do I get involved? So now I am the president here in Las Vegas, and it's been great. I work with a lot of the same people you guys work with as well as I work, with the casinos in town, a lot of the small to medium-sized businesses that just don't have that understanding of what cybersecurity is. Most small to medium-sized businesses don't understand they need it until they're breached, right? Kind of scenario. So those are the kind of things that we do. And then I have a team here of system administrators, network engineers, technicians, help desks that are locally here that help support me in my business. So most of the time, it's a lot of going around to understand what businesses are needing, keeping a pulse on what's going on in cyber, because it's changing daily, if not hourly. And then also, managing a team. I have a huge team here that I need to make sure that, hey, they have things under control that they're running on. I fully trust my team. I'm very happy that I have a good team. But again, to get to that point did take some time.
And now, just to kind of, we'll work our way up to that. So if you just kind of give me a brief summary of kind of where you grew up and eventually what kind of got you interested in technology. Like everybody has a different point in time that kind of where that bug or that desire to kind of learn more started. So what was your introduction?
Yeah, so, didn't come from a tech background. My father was a welder. Mom was a home caretaker for elderly people. So didn't have a lot of tech. So my first tech thing was a Super Nintendo that I bought myself. I had to work for it and pay for myself. And then I just kind of got involved with it. I saw, started some cool stuff around the house, like building these little circuit boards they used to make, and used to make lights go bright and dim and stuff like that. You remember those? And then my famous story is that back in the old days, when I was a kid, they had cordless phones. Remember the ones they pull out with? So I had this, I got one from the thrift store because back then they were expensive. So we got one from the thrift store, being thrifty as we were, and I'm going to make this thing work. So, I started taking it apart, and it's always taking it apart's the easy part, right? Putting it back together. So I'm taking the thing apart and not knowing nothing about electricity. I'm like, oh, I need to splice this wire. And so instead of using my finger, I used my teeth with 120 ports plugged into the wall. And I learned that way about electricity, but also I learned, it was kind of funny. That's how I got my, it excited me. I was like, technology is this cool kind of scenario. So it kind of drove me. So I've always had that on my mind kind of scenario, what I wanted to do. I went to school for something totally different. I went to school for hospitality management at UNLV, which is the feeder program. So I grew up in San Diego, went to a feeder school out there called Mesa Junior College. So, got my 2-year associates there in hotel management. And then I'm like, what do I do? UNLV has one of the best hotel programs in the nation. Applied, I got in. I'm like, wow, that's cool. So started that journey through UNLV. Not to say I put tech aside. It was just like, in my day, tech wasn't big. This was very early, of the 2000s, before Y2K, all that stuff. So tech wasn't a huge thing back then. So the emphasis was more like, hey, you got to know about tech because, if you're going to be a hotel manager, you need to know that we have terminals that people need to check in on. We have credit card machines, stuff like that. But it wasn't the emphasis. It wasn't the bread and butter of the career. So, I kept that in mind and said, okay, how do I leverage this? So funny enough, I graduated. What do? I got a part-time job at a casino working as a technician. So I kind of said, I want to work on the slot machines to make sure they work correctly. So what we do, go through there, clean them out. If they were broken, if they didn't accept bills, we'd come in there, clean them out, make sure they worked, kind of scenarios. So I worked for a small casino here in town, eventually led me to Caesar's Palace here in Las Vegas, which was a fun job that I got to work at, but in this technology realm. But I noticed that I said, hey, I thought to myself, like, okay, these slot machines are great. They're built on really old Linux technology. Like, this career doesn't seem like it's going to go anywhere. Like, I don't know. I don't see the future. So I started understanding, okay, all these slot machines feed into a centralized database. Now this database is huge, right? It collects all the data for all the slot machine. Every time you put $1 in, every time you put your card in, all that data and analytics then kind of compresses, and then they create the marketing programs off it. I'm like, I need to get in there. So I started reverse engineering and said, okay, well, now I know this job will probably not be here forever because technology will take that over. So where's that next leap? And I started tracing that back and says the database is where I need to be. So I started learning about databases. So on my own, just trying to say, hey, what does all this stuff do? So it's a very simple SQL database, right, that collects all the data. And then they use report generators to report the stuff out. Nothing super complex. So, and again, my background, I'm not super technical, right? I grew up through more of the project management, project delivery role and the product delivery role rather than the technical hands-on keyboard. What I knew I was good at was managing, making sure deadlines are good. Making sure that, hey, if they says, hey, we need to deliver this project or this technology, I know that through just how I am, I can drill in and say, okay, looking backwards, we need to deliver to the customer on this day. What do we need to do to get there? Or we need to deliver to the customer on this day. What do we? And I have this kind of innate ability to see that out. And I didn't figure this out till later on in life, but it was one of those innate abilities to say, okay, well, not only do I understand how much time do I need to build this, but I also need to understand how much resources are needed, how much time, how much money, how much allocations are for all this stuff is kind of combined into one. So doing that, I did a couple projects. I'm like, this is amazing. I was built for this. This is project management. Product management is kind of where I love. And so I kind of developed that role and I kind of developed myself as a project. Then this was before like project management was even kind of a job. It was, they knew about it, like project managers were there, but it wasn't as bountiful as it is today. So it was really cool to kind of learn in that. And then, eventually I kind of got in the place where I'm like, cool, great. I got to understand the not so much the data. I mean, I could sit down there with a coder and say, hey, SQL database administrator, run this query. And then, in the tech world, not to get too technical, it's going to come back with a query of rows of data, right? But you can kind of look back at that and say, hey, every row has a name, has a header, has a row count. So you can go through there and say, okay, this data makes sense, or it doesn't. It's just garbage, right? So being that, I'm not, I am technical, but I'm like super in the weeds technical, but I know how to drive teams and processes to get us to where we need to go. So that all wrapped up was kind of fun and exciting with Caesar's Palace. They said they owned a cruise ship at that time. And I got to go out there and work on a cruise ship. So
interesting point there where you mentioned that, you kind of on your own kind of developed that curiosity of like, hey, how does this work and understanding. So does a lot of that project management, kind of understanding the deliverables and hey, how does this work and being able, again, you have to be technical to at least understand what's going on. Was a lot of that from your innate curiosity of just being able to say, okay, this is how long it takes me to develop, or clean out a slot machine. This is, you're kind of piecing those smaller pieces together of your own understanding of how long something takes, or how did you build that skill of I can deliver on time because I know how long this will take or that will take, or database administrator, I need you to make these types of changes or pull this information for me. Like, how did you determine how do you determine timelines?
And great question. I got to attribute to my mom, honestly, because my mom, we didn't have a lot of stuff growing up, early on in life, but my mom was scrappy. She would figure stuff out. She would always deliver birthday, always deliver Christmas. And she was just one of those people that can just honestly go out and says, okay, my son wants this. And again, it wasn't nothing, outrageous, but my son needs this or my daughter needs this. What am I going to do to figure this out kind of scenario? She's kind of like my, what I give my credit to, because I've always had that in my mind of like, okay, understand that. Because again, like, not everybody is going to be super technical, right? Kind of scenario, but not everyone's going to have a project management mindset. And they're two totally different parts of the mind, right? And that's why they need each other. What I was really good at is understanding the programmers, understanding developers and stuff like that. And just having a realistic talk like you are and say, okay, here's our realistic timeline. Is this achievable? Right? Like, getting the feedback from them instead of, I think the problem with a lot of projects, why they fail nowadays, is that project manager kind of takes that stuff back and just says, oh yeah, we're going to make it work, and they're trying to figure it out. You can't do that. You need to go to the people you rely on every day and say, okay, I need this piece. Tell me what's going to take. And, maybe buffer in a little bit. I need this piece from you. How long is that going to take? And again, 90% of the time it's going to slip, but as long as you're realistic with them and say, hey, what happened? Are you going to make it up? And most times, good people are going to be like, yeah, we'll make it up. Give me another day. That's all I need. We've all been in that situation, right? And just having that understanding. And I think that's what Billy built me to be successful in that job, was just being adaptive people to understand what their needs are and what their timelines are, and backing that into an actual project, right? And then you kind of put it all together and say, this is what I can do.
And then over time, I'm sure you're kind of developing that expertise, right?
Yes.
To where you can go through and like, okay, I know I have a better understanding. So if a developer tells you, hey, I'm going to get this done in a week, you know that maybe it might be a week and a half, or hey, he's putting in buffer time. I think we could probably get it done in 4 days, right? But initially, yeah, it sounds like having to really have those conversations and say, hey, how long is this going to take? Okay, realistically, and being transparent, right? And say, okay, we didn't hit the deadline, or you finished early. Why did you finish early, right? And just kind of get a better understanding.
It's a hierarchy, right? Because the CEO is going to say, I can deliver it tomorrow. The sales guy is going to say, I can deliver next week. The project manager is going to say, I'm going to leave it in 2 weeks. And the developer is going to say, I'm going to deliver it in a month, right? So how do you massage that to say, what's realistic, right? What can we deliver it on? What can't we deliver it on? And pushing all that together.
So then as you're kind of learning all this database stuff, and it sounds like that's kind of, I'm assuming, when you kind of saw that, hey, being a slot technician is not going to be the career path for you, you start to pick up databases. So now are you just kind of searching job boards to figure out how you can kind of move out into other roles? Because again, there's not a defined project manager role like it is today. Technology's early. So what kind of made you decide, or kind of what was your thought process to say, I need to go out, and kind of what did that look like?
Yeah, so I think I just took a second and said, okay, now I have to figure out, like, where do I go with it, right? Because I think you have two options, right? Operations or vendor, right? And that's, I think a lot of people make that decision in their career, right? So I say, that path in the road, where does that go? So I was working in operations, it was great, but then I'd see these vendor guys come on site and they were like, kind of flashy. I'm like, they got a credit card? What? They got this and that. And you're like, that's kind of a cool job being on the vendor side. And I didn't realize they're like, yeah, we get to travel around the world. We get to do this and stuff. And when you're young, it's very influential to you, because you're like, I'm stuck between these four walls, and I kind of come see the same thing. And for me, it was kind of like, I like that because it's a little bit more, versatile, so I can go out there and figure more stuff out, and then you're kind of understanding other technologies as well. So from there, I got a job with Bally. It used to be called Bally Technologies. Now it's called Light and Wonder, but that manufacturer there, they were the main person that I did the database work for, or the project management database for. So I was like, well, I extrapolated that and just did a jump, right? So, okay, well, if they're our vendor for the casino I'm working for, they'd love to have you, right? Kind of scenario. So there's a little bit of a non-compete going on there, but you have to wait that out. But once you get over that side, you're like, great, now you're learning that. So all that information you took from your operations, now you're working for a vendor, and now your plate just wide open, because now you're not just talking about, okay, what happens at this one company A in the four walls. Now I'm working with company B, C, and D who have the same proprietary software, but I'm learning what they do and how they're driving and what they're doing different from other companies. So now you're taking that wealth of information from all these companies instead of just one, and now you're become this invaluable asset where you have relationships with the customers, which are the casinos. You have relationships. You understand the product. And so now you're a golden child for, for either a job or for, whatever that next leap that you want to go into to be successful.
You're kind of gathering all this information, and I'm sure, some people might be okay and just like, hey, I like what I do, and you're there, but it sounded like you had bigger aspirations and more curiosity, because you're right. Like I did operations for a long time. Eventually I moved into, so I worked for a VAR, which is a value-added reseller, right? So you're kind of going through, and it's on the vendor side. And I knew that this vendor, this VAR, did a lot of work for casinos. I had experience there, so they're like, hey, you'd be a great fit. You understand infrastructure, but it is completely different. I knew what I did at this casino. I had experience from, I worked at 2 different casinos, so it was like Boyd Gaming. I worked for Coast Casinos. A lot of similarities, but a lot of differences. And then now you're getting exposed to multiple at the same time, and you're just like, oh my God, like, why are you doing it this way? And my first inclination was like, well, that's dumb. Why would you do it that way? But then you have to understand there's a business reason behind it, right? It's not just like, well, we're doing this way because we just felt like it, right? Like there's something in their operations. So my guess is that as you're kind of doing all this, you're gaining all this information, apart from resources and building a network, your experience and your expertise is starting to grow. So at what point do you kind of determine, I remember looking at your LinkedIn, I kind of followed it. So there's a couple where you kind of stayed for a while and there was like upward growth, and then eventually, there's times where you've kind of decide to move to another role. You don't have to talk about it specifically in this one, but kind of what's your thought process on how do you develop in the same business versus deciding to go out somewhere else?
Yeah, it's a difficult question, and I reflect on that a lot. I'm a project manager by heart. Lesson learns is what I live and die by. So I reflect on that a lot of like, okay, if I would have did a different path, or I could have did something else differently in my life, what would I have done? And kind of interesting enough, like, it's tough because you want to make the trajectory growth and develop and go along the way. Now, some companies are great of internal growth, as you know. They're like, okay, great, but some company, but it's tough because once you know the product and you've kind of found your niche and you kind of do it in your sleep, they don't want to promote you because they have this great person and it's a perfect fit and that's what they do. And for me personally, it was like, that's handicapping my growth, because now I can't move up, because now they have me kind of cornholed in this position, which I'm good at. I know what I'm doing. I'm great at it, and I've been complimented by everybody, but now, like, okay, you have to kind of figure out, what do I do with that, right? So it was a hard decision to say, okay, let me step back and let me go on to another role. And that other role was the director position, going from a manager to a director position, right? So project manager to a director position. And that was a big jump, because now, project directors in most medium or small companies, you're wearing both hats. You either have your own kind of projects, and you're also mentoring and managing project managers in that kind of realm to keep everything afloat, deliverable times and stuff like that. So I needed to make that jump to get where I needed to go for that project, for that director position. And then eventually the VP position, which was even harder to get to. But every step of those 2 steps were very difficult. I mean, I'm not going to say they were easy, because it's one of those things that, like I said, once you're good at something, they don't want to let you go. So how do you do that? And sometimes you have to make that jump from one company to another just to get that experience that they're going to try you out to get this opportunity.
And you mentioned, right, you become that invaluable resource. At any point, did you kind of decide like, hey, you know what, I am this person. I don't want to be this person. And outside of making a leap, maybe how do I kind of bring somebody else in to kind of do that role? And the only reason I say this is because I kind of fell into something similar, right? Where I was like, well, you become this person that is like the go-to, right? Like you eventually become that person. So one of the things, and I wish I kind of would have learned this earlier, but I got brought into a role. I took on a project that eventually I became that person. And it was basically managing. So I worked for an airline and I was supposed to be a storage administrator. There was a project because I had VMware experience. VMware had a product where they would be able to manage devices, right? So device management, managing iPads for flight attendants. Okay, I have experience. I know the technology. So I thought it was just going to be the back end setting that up. But once you do, now that's your job. And I was like, I don't want to do this. This is terrible. Like I don't want to come to work today and manage iPads all day. Like this sounds horrible. Eventually, when I went to the manager and I was like, hey, I don't want to do this. Here's the amount of time I'm spending. He basically said, why don't you go through and document all this or train somebody else up so that you're not the sole person. And there's other times, like after he said that, I was like, well, can I do that? And he's like, yeah, well, we can hand this off to somebody else, but you've got to train them or you've got to have documentation. I used to hate it. And to this day, I'm not a big fan of doing it, but I see the value. Like I document it, train people up. And I think that's where I started to get that passion for helping and bringing other people. Like I was always the receiving end of, hey, you mentor me, you help me. And it was kind of that position where I'm like, well, now I can do the same for other people. So I'm just curious if at any point did something like that happen for you as you're moving, or you're just kind of like, the only way for me to get out of this is to make that jump?
Yeah, I mean, if you're fortunate enough, if you have that opportunity, then take it, because again, unfortunately, in corporate America, not everybody wants you to succeed, right? So you kind of run into some of the roadblocks. And again, like, and again, when you're a project manager, yeah, you have to make those tough decisions sometimes where you can't be the nice guy all the time because you're just going to get ran over all the time. So, it just becomes how do I explain it? So I think more importantly, yes, if you have that mentorship that's available to you, grab onto it, run with it, grab that rope if someone is offering it to you. It just doesn't happen very often, right? Because a lot of people have their own agendas in mind. And, unfortunately, I didn't have a lot of, I've had a few good bosses or leaders in my life, but, I'd say more often than not, it was that, okay, we found a round hole for you. You fit perfectly in there. Just stay there. Just make it work kind of scenario. I did, but not to say all the time. There was a couple times that it did have good leaders that did say, hey, you need to develop out and get to your next place. But, it's not as often as I would like it to be.
Got it. So then now you're moving up into this director position, right? And that's a big jump from manager to director. So what are some of the challenges you came across in making that transition?
Yeah, so typically when most people make that jump, like you have two options, right? One, either you work a long time at the same company and someone either wins the lottery, I like to say, and you get to move up, or you might be a good time where you start someone, the other person leaves, and you get that opportunity. For me, I had to look at my situation and say, okay, I'm with a great company. How do I become that direct position? And so for me, it was to go with a startup company. So it was a new startup company here in town that said, hey, we're looking for a director of project management, and we're willing to give someone that has your expertise because their main 90% of the business was casino. So, and all their business was databases. It was more of it was back in the big data days. Well, so it was a big data company, right? When that was the old AI back then. So it was a big data company. And so I took a took a stab at them and said, okay, they're going to offer me this position. I mean, I know it's not, the Fortune 500 company, but they're going to give me the title. So I said, okay, I'm going to try for it. I got the job, and it was great to get that. But the bad side of that, you're with the company, right? There's no really loose policies. There's really loose documentation, structure, stuff like that. It's a fun organization because everybody wants the company to succeed. But the other side of that is that you have to build on that framework, right? You have to come in there. There was no PMO documentation. There was no PMO. There was no, so you have to build all that. So it was a great opportunity for me to build a PMO within this organization, hire all the PMs and get them going and developed and trained, and then also make sure we have standards in place that we're actually being able to hit deadlines.
And it's not often that I have a lot of people that have been in a management or director role. So, and especially where you're building this from scratch. So as you're kind of going through and, you're interviewing, you're trying to hire, right? What are things that you look for? I'm not going to say on their resume, but like more like in the interview process, right? What are some things that you've, even as yourself going through and interviewing, like skills that you have identified, like, hey, this is helpful to me, this helped me get into this role,
right?
Especially like a director role, hey, I have this experience, but you've got to be able to communicate that. And then how are you also identifying those qualities or traits that you're looking for in interviewees?
Yeah, great question. Honestly, it's no one's what they are on paper, right? Paper is just, it gets your foot in the door, right? Your experience, whatever it is. Because here's the thing, like you can have the technical mindset, the technical adaptation, but if you can't be nice and work with your coworkers or, anything like that, it's disastrous, right? And sometimes you have to make those tough decisions as managers, like, hey, this guy's a great technician, this guy's a great person, but on the other side of that, he doesn't want to work with anybody. So you have to balance that out to understand, like, okay, well, invite him in, talk to him about, get him to loosen up a little bit, say, hey, what is it you want out of this job? And again, and maybe my mindset's a little bit different because I'm like, okay, I want you to stay here as long as you want. But a lot of these people are like, hey, I want to work for the Amazons. I want to work for the bigger companies. So I say, what is your ambition? Like, what do you want to get out of it? Well, I want a longevity and, I eventually want to work for a Fortune 500 company. Great. Like, how do you get there, right? What are those steps? And I'm like, okay, well, we can be that stepping stone. And I'm okay with that. I'm okay developing people out to be that next person, to be what they want to go on their journey, as long as they commit to that 100%. So for me, it's not so much about the technical skills. It's more about the adaptation to being able to pivot, right? Like say, okay, well, especially for us, we're still a small business. We have a few people, but we're not like, a Fortune 500 company. But, we got to be able to say sometimes we have to wear many hats, right? Sometimes our system engineer is doing network jobs because we just don't have everybody enough people at that certain time. So it's more about just being able to say the willingness. And I think employers now are starting to understand that, like, that attitude goes a long way. And just being able to say, yes, yeah, okay, I'll show up. Just showing up on time, being there, being the person that says, yes, I'll do it, instead of trying to pull it out of them to get what you need from them.
At the director level, in those types of scenarios, like how involved are you in the firing or the letting go of people, right? Because you mentioned like, hey, if you have those conversations and it's, as much as we would like to think that we can turn everybody around and they're going to be great, there are scenarios where it's not going to work out, right? Like we're at odds. Right. Either they aren't getting what they want out of this role or you're not getting it from them like what you're expecting. So what are some of the challenges with having to kind of let people go, right?
Yeah, it's tough because you never want to let anybody go. Right? I mean, that's like the last resort. You try to bring them in, you mentor them to see what that is. Because again, and it's tough because through my career, you have two options. Like you have one where you're coming into a startup where you get to develop your own team, which is great. Because then you're not going to have that big of turnover, right? Because again, you're going to develop those people. You're going to screen them ahead of time to know they're going to be good, bad, or indifferent. The tougher situation is when you become a director and you have to make the decision where people that they've been there for years. They know more than you. And they're not scared to tell you that, right? And you're just like, okay, now we got to have this discussion, right? Kind of scenario. So, you walk into a situation where you become a director and guess what? The person next to you applied for that job too. And now you got to be his manager. That's an awkward situation to be in. So how do you how do you confront that, right? So I usually just sit down with them and say, hey, basically, how can we make this work, right? From a letting go perspective, how, if I've kind of went through the process, which is, the written warning, the suspensions and stuff like that, and it's just not working out, you have to sit down with them and says, what is that career path? What I try to do a lot of times, I try to say, okay, this isn't working out for either. I'll pull you conversation. This isn't working out. What can we do? I mean, if you're not going to change, I'm not going to change. How can we make this, what can we do? And, sometimes I was able to a few times say, why don't we do this? Why don't you go out and look for another job? I'll be your biggest cheerleader and you can find that other job. And that's worked out a few times. Like, it's just, hey, you know what? Like, great. I got this other guy. He was working for us and then he went to JT3 and he was like, this is my dream job. I've been wanting. And he was a level 1 technician and he went to go work for a government agent, which was huge for him, right? So it's just opening up those opportunities that they just don't see. They just don't have they have blinders on, so they just don't see that.
So a lot of it's just really communicating with them, right? I mean, that's at the end of it.
As you grow, as your career goes, less time is spent on the technical stuff. Like, you're like, I like the technical. Forget that. It's all dealing with two aspects. You got stakeholders, which are going to be your peers and managers, and then you're going to have your employees, right? That are going to make or break you at the end of the day. But yeah, it's a people job. So be prepared when you want to move up and understand that, like, your job's changing, right? You're not going to be called. I mean, on occasion you might be called for them, but you want it to be more of a guidance role. Because, as I was a director, the project was going off the rails. Now I come in and I don't want to go in there and take it over from the person, because what's that going to do? It's going to diminish their self-esteem, everything about them. So bring them over and just be like, hey, what can we do together? Let's figure this out. Let's work together. Okay, let me do this, you do that, and then we get the project back on track, kind of scenario. But 90% of your time is now spent on people.
And what did you do to kind of develop those skills, right? So like we go back to the database part, right? Like you look up especially nowadays, right? You can look up YouTube videos, you probably were reading books, maybe just messing around, tinkering with yourself. But as you're kind of developing and understanding, it's less tech. Like, you still have to understand it, right? You still got to be aware of how things work. But now you're having to develop communication skills and management skills. So what are some of the ways that you kind of develop that? And is there any like gotchas along the way where you're like, I wish I would have known this would have either helped accelerate that learning or maybe not had as many missteps along the way?
Right. I think you're always learning, right? Because I don't think you're ever going to master it. For me, Stephen Covey I'm a huge fan of, right? How to win friends and influence others, right? Just understanding, like, hey, my greatest quote from him is like, if you want an employee or a person that's going to love you every day and walk in your job and love you, then get a dog. That's it, because that's unconditional love. Every time you come home, your dog's like, I love you, master. But you go to work every day, that employee's not going to be that same way. So it's just understanding how people, and you're just kind of peeling that back, like, what motivates people? What gets people up in the morning? It goes back to saying, you don't want to ever become a micromanager, but you don't want to be laissez-faire. Where's that medium at? So you have to balance them out. And I still struggle with that today, right? Kind of scenario, like with my team, like, okay, I have to entrust the leaders I put in place to develop that. Now, they might not do it the same way I do, but I have to appreciate it because they'll get the job done, but it's not always going to be the way you want it to be done. So I think a lot of that is just, one is learning. Your first director position, or even manager position, you're going to learn a lot because you're dealing with the human element, which is no one can predict it. Like people come in and have bad days. People come in and have great days. People get sick in the middle of a go live. You have all these factors that go on in that. You have to balance them out and say, okay, well, now a manager, how do I put all these pieces together? Okay, if my main guy that I rely on for everything, if he's out sick today, what do I do? So you have to put in redundant. Then you start figuring out, okay, well, I need a redundancy. If this main guy, this person that I love and he's great, but he wins the lottery next day, where's my failover? Where's my backup kind of scenario? So you have to look at that in those angles as well. So it's really about the people.
And that's just something that obviously there's going to be no one job, or there's not the books are helpful, but there's no really one way that you could just be like, oh man, do this thing and figure it out similar. Like, it's not as prescriptive as kind of learning databases, right? Like, I can read a book, I can watch, I understand it. Now, there's troubleshooting involved. Excuse me. There's going to be troubleshooting involved that will come up that you kind of have to figure out. But for the most part, if you understand databases and you can read and learn, but from the management side, that's not going to be the same case.
Yeah, there's a lot, there's a lot of information out there for teamworks, for coaching, developing and stuff like that. And they're great, right? Just understanding, how are you pushing your team to achieve next level results, right? How are you developing, atomic habits? There's a lot of good stuff out there to understand how these are driving. But I always say, like, one thing you can't ever read or know about is the human element. Because everyone's different, right? There's no two people the same, and especially in technology is like, and I'm sure you deal with this in tech. I love tech, right? I've been in it many years, but tech is, there's a lot of egos, and I think that's the biggest thing in tech is, and that I always say, when I used to hire project managers, like, a project manager has to have an ego, and I want him to have an ego because he needs to be the captain of that ship, right? And when the storm hits, he needs to be at that helm and going through the storm. But, at the same time, he needs to be personable and relatable and stuff like that. Because if you don't have that ego and you're a project manager, you're going to get ran over all day. And it's just kind of the things. So it's in tech especially, you have a lot of egos. So to manage those, it's not easy, right? Kind of scenario. Because you got people, hey, I've been here since day one. You don't know more than me, and you're walking into this new job and you're the manager and you're like, well, I'm not trying to tell you what to do. I just kind of want you just to come to work every day on time, or stuff like that, and it's just the trivial stuff that, but you can't say that. So how do you do it, right? You can say it, don't get me wrong, but you don't want to say it. You want them to adapt to learn. So what do you do? Okay, hey, you see this kid coming in every day. Hey, let's have coffee every other day to get them in that routine at 8 o'clock. I'll put a stand-up meeting every other day. Let's have coffee. I want to get caught up because I want to know more about what you do or what he does or she does or kind of scenario.
So it's just finding ways more to not necessarily tell people what to do, but kind of similar, like in that book, right? You're trying to find ways to influence them to change that behavior and say, okay, I don't want to say incentivize, but really kind of understand and say, okay, hey, come here and show up on time. And if it means I've got to do coffee with you, like, you're starting to kind of alter their behavior over time.
Yeah, and it's twofold, right? It's also like, okay, so say you have this guy that, does come in late every day, or girl, I should say, it does come in late every day, but this person, when 5 o'clock hits, she'll keep working until the job's done, 8 o'clock. So now what do you do in that aspect, right? So now you're in a weird situation where, like, gosh, like, I have this other guy who comes in every day at 8 o'clock, but then clocks out at 5, no matter what. Then I have this other person that comes in 8:15, but she's here till the job's done. It's a stark contrast, but how do you manage those kind of things? And for me personally, it's like, okay, well, because now the guy that you're telling to come in every day on time, saying, well, what about Sally Joe because she's late, but she, so it's dealing with those kind of things. And how do you manage them, right? Kind of scenarios. So you have to be a little bit creative, kind of scenario and say, hey, if you're not gonna be on time, just give me a text or whatever. And most of the time, it kind of all flattens out. But it's those dynamics that no book's going to train you for, no YouTube video is going to train you for. You're going to have to adapt that to understand it. Because again, that person working until 5, 6, 7, it's invaluable because again, like she's taking time out of her life afterwards and she's making sure the job is done, which is huge.
You've kind of become at this director level and you've kind of moved around. So what, at that level, at some point you get to, either a CIO, CEO at that level, what is kind of the career path that you decide to change or work towards at that point? Are you kind of moving around? Is it you're looking for different challenges? So like the startup was probably great because it gave you the title, right? So, hey, now I'm a director. You're building stuff from scratch. You're learning a lot. What is kind of the career path moving forward? Like, how do you determine where you want to go, what you want to do?
Yeah, I mean, some people, and I'm a little bit different. Some people are like, hey, hit that director, I'm good. Director's a good title, right? Don't get me wrong, it's a good mid-manager title. You get some good perks, but you also get, the prestige of being a director, right? For me, I've always wanted to be, at the top, and it's just self-driven where I wanted to go. So I was like, okay. So for me, it happened over COVID. Weird enough, right? COVID hit. We're like, what happened, bro? Like casino shut down. I was the director of the PMO over at Golden Entertainment, and we just got done doing the $700 million renovation for the Stratosphere Hotel. And they're like, all right, guys, we're shutting down the casino. And we're like, PMO, unfortunately, is usually one of the first to go because there's no projects, right? I mean, so, they just kept the bare minimum crew, which was like their VP of ops. And I think they kept their cyber guy and a few others, but that was it. So I was like, dang, what do I do? So I kind of stuck back and kind of said, okay, well, let me figure some stuff out. And, I started applying online and there was a job for vice president of IT at Goodwill. And I was like, that's kind of cool. I get to give back. It's a good government organization, or a good organization, but I also get to give back to what, to my roots, because, not coming from much. So I applied and they were like, yeah, I'd love to have you, I mean, pay wasn't great. I didn't do it for the pay, absolutely. But I did it more for giving back and also for the opportunity. So I said, great. I enrolled in it, got signed up. They were like, great, have you on board. And then that was a whole different kind of demographics because now you're dealing with all different kind of skill sets. All different, I mean, anything from, and issues, right? Because again, they don't pay a lot of money, right? So now, you as a VP of IT is not making a lot. Imagine what's your first level, it trickles down, right? So how do you kind of understand them and develop them in kind of scenario in that? But yeah, it's, that jump was kind of weird because again, it happened over COVID. And also I was like, I wanted to give the opportunity back, but also, not to be greedy, but it was also for me as well, right? Kind of scenario. So I got to make that next jump and that was exciting. Was there for, about 2 years and got to change some stuff around. I brought in cybersecurity. It's where I got a lot of my passion for cyber at was during those times. Done a few cyber installs for the casinos, but this was where I got to get hands-on to understand the technology and stuff like that. So it was a great experience for me to learn all that stuff. So from a career perspective, yeah, I kind of had to take a step back, to go forward kind of scenario. Because again, great, I could have been another director, I could have been a project manager and, at another company and made more money, but that's not my end all goal. And it's never, personally for me, I've never been driven by money. It's always, that I did chase the title, I'll be honest with you. Now there was some good and bads about it. Some of the stuff I would have did totally different. But then you kind of get to the point where you're like, okay, well, I've been a, vice president of IT for a few years. And now you got, there's project managers probably at like Tesla making twice as much as me. And you're like, where did I go wrong in my life, right? Kind of scenario. But like I said, I was never driven by the money. I like to challenge myself and I always like to drive for that next best thing.
And you bring up an important point, right? A lot of times people think that even if you're chasing title, right? And I get it, COVID, it's a different scenario where like, hey, I need to find something. But a lot of times people aren't willing to kind of take that step back and say, okay, hey, I'm going to take less money. It's going to be a different challenge. It's a different set of challenges and different set of ideas. So what did you kind of learn? And I don't know if maybe this is the first time where you've kind of had to step back to eventually move forward, right? A lot of times, and I'm sure at the time it happened, you're like, well, it's this or nothing else. But kind of what did you learn from that? And what did you kind of gain as part of that experience?
It's humbling, right? Kind of scenario, because again, you get a certain lifestyle of, how much you make, and you kind of count on that. And then from a financial perspective, you're like, okay, I had to really, really evaluate my finances, right? To say, hey, I'm not going to be able to get that fancy car I wanted next year or whatever it was. But for me, it was, the opportunity, right? So say if you're like, say, a level one tech or technician or whatever it is, and you're like, okay, I want to become that manager position, but I know I can't be a manager here, or I will never get that opportunity, or I tried and it's just not working out. You just might not be the right fit for that company, right? So you go to another company and they see the value, and then you are more valuable to that company as you grow up through that change. But I think more importantly is that position that you get, that you might not be making the same amount of money, you might be learning a lot more, or you might be learning a different skill set that may be a better fit for you, right? So it's always that learning evolution that you kind of go through and kind of figure stuff out as you go through. Like, and again, I don't think mine was intentional per se. It was just like because of COVID, right? Was the big thing. But also, hey, it was part of the overall where I wanted to go, right? Where I thought I wanted to go at that time in my life, right? I did make some twists and tweaks to that after that, because I think that I realized at that time in my life, I was like, okay, well, VP of IT was great, but I just don't think that's what I want to do for the rest of my life. So I did pivot after that, but it gave me the opportunity to taste it, right? And that's what you got to do. As some people are like, hey, I know people that's been like a data DBA or a system engineer, all their life, and they're like, I am good here. I know what I need to do. I can do it in my sleep. This is where I'm at. So it's just kind of one of those things that you have to understand, like, are you okay going to that next room? Because again, it is a title. It's good. It looks great in the resume, but sometimes it's not worth it for everybody. Now, some people it is, but I would say, like, just evaluate that, right? And it's okay. Sometimes you try it and you're like, this is for the birds. And then you kind of go back and kind of scenario. And I've done that too, where I kind of like, hey, I tested, my goal was to be VP of IT. I made the goal, and then I'm like, this isn't my cup of tea. And then I kind of went back to consulting for a few years. And then I, was like, okay, well, consulting is great, but now I'm ready to do my own thing. But you kind of learn, you learn, you kind of, as you go through that process.
And as you're going through, so even people who maybe want to move around, right? How did you develop the confidence to say, I can move out and move around, right? Because it's very easy for some people, and for other people it's not, right? So I am one of those people that, like, when feel like I've reached the plateau in this area, I'm not so worried about, oh my gosh, it's going to be so difficult, or I don't get the anxiousness of that new role, because my mindset is I'm not growing here. Again, if it gets to the point where it's on autopilot for me, like, I know I've got to leave, and the anxiety for me of staying in this role is more than the unknown. And for you, kind of what was that? I mean, everybody's motivated different, right? You're chasing titles and doing that. So was it the ultimate goal of achieving that title is less anxious than stepping into a new role?
It's hard to say. Like, I've always been a driven person. Like, if I set my mind to something, I most of the time get it. But it's just more just understanding from my perspective. It's a great question, because, like, to think about it now is like, if I were to do it all over again, I probably wouldn't have, right? If I were to say, hey, I would, and I tell my kids this today, I was like, if I do it all over again, I would join the military just to get structure in my life. Just to get, I waste too many years at the bar, just to get that structure. Like, okay, what, get that structure, and then kind of go to college to learn everything, and then kind of, and then, get an internship, right? Utilize internships. Even though they don't pay anything, I mean, they're so invaluable to the connections you make and the people you meet. Because some of those same people that I met early on in my career, I'm still friends with today. And gaming, as you know, is such a small world, right? We all know everybody, and you go to the big convention, you're like a high school reunion, oh yeah, kind of scenario. I love going to the conventions, but it's one of those things that you just kind of get back and say, okay, well, for me personally, yeah, it was, and maybe it's a little bit egotistical with me, but I remember like when I was younger, I was like, okay, I got this director title. I'm just going to apply for this job to see if I get it. And 9 times out of 10, I probably wouldn't follow up on it, but I would just be like, let's try it. And it would to feed my ego, right? Kind of scenario. And, and every once in a while they'd call you back and be like, oh, well, maybe I do have it for that. And, for me personally, I always tried to challenge myself to see, and that's how I test the waters. Let me just throw my resume out there. Let me just apply for this job. And, great. If it leads into something, wonderful. If it didn't, then, just not meant to be, but I'm not hung up on it kind of scenario. But yeah, I mean, again, I think it's double-edged. And I think nowadays, you hear both ends of the spectrum, right? People say, stay with the company, stay devoted, and you'll kind of move up the path. And other people say, no, you have to jump, kind of scenario. I don't know what the right, wrong, or indifferent, what's the right thing. But for me personally, there's a couple jobs that I probably wish I would have stayed at a little longer, honestly, in retrospect, and not jump as fast. But, I self-diagnosed ADHD, so I kind of got to keep moving.
No, I completely get it. And I realized being diagnosed later on that was a thing that kind of drove me to kind of move around, where I've talked to other people and they're like, oh my gosh, like, again, I'm not looking for you to tell me like, this is what you should do, or that's what this person should do. It's just your experience and trying to understand, kind of what that process is. So now it sounds like we're getting to the point where you decide to kind of move and venture on into your own and kind of franchise. So how did that come about, and what really made you decide that it's time for me to do it on my own? Because not that it's not your company, but when you're moving up into VP, director levels, you do get a little bit more influence into how you want things to run, especially with the startup. You got to build it and say, hey, within parameters of, hey, this is the company, and I have to build around this or within this. What made you say it's time for me to do it on my own? And what was the difference between now I'm going to franchise and, I'm going to do it my way versus, well, I'll do it my way, but within these guidelines?
Right. So, I mean, after leaving Goodwill, I was like, okay, what do I do? Went back into I went to consulting, and, as we all know, consulting pays good. But it's the same kind of scenario where like, okay, well, great, I'm consulting, but like when you consult, you're never treated as an employee. You're just that kind of guy that's there that, okay, he's here to make sure we do what we're supposed to do kind of scenario. So I'm on this huge Salesforce deployment. And it's just like, and I got to the point where I'm like, okay, got done with the project. I feel good. Okay, we want you for the next one. And I just like, you know what? I'm okay. I mean, I think for me, I've always been one of the people that can't stay still. So I'm always working on something on the side. So I've always had like either like a side business or something I developed on the side. So early in my career, I developed an app for rental properties. So basically, this was before they had all the fancy apps out there, but it was just more of an integration app where it says, instead of, you have a VRBO or you have a Airbnb, it kind of connects your cleaning lady with with all your bills and kind of puts it all in one place, right? Kind of scenario. It was fun. I got to develop it. Didn't make any money, but it was a fun kind of process. And then I got I went and sold it, gave it away pretty much. And then I ended up going to, I started at like a consulting company where it was like, Wizzo.com. It was a really interesting thing where I was like, okay, well, how do I leverage this? And it was kind of a part-time thing where I was still consulting for myself, but I started this kind of business of this kind of staff augmentation, right? Where a staffing company or something like that, some in that area. And that was okay, but I was like, man, this kind of sucks. I'm not making any money. and I'm spending all my time just kind of babysitting. And I was like, okay, this isn't gonna work. I won't do this anymore. And then I'm like, okay, I needed to get it. So I was actually looking at different businesses. I was like, okay, maybe I'm just not gonna do tech. I started looking at plumbing, upholstery, just like random stuff. Like I'm like, I just want to start my own business. So it's always been a dream for me to do my own business. No, I've had little business, but never like something I've 100% my time in, to jump with both feet in. So this was the first time I said, okay, I'm leaving everything. I'm leaving the nest egg. I'm investing everything I have into this business. And it's scary because you're putting all your chips in the table. But for me, it was like, I was like, okay, what do I want? So I said, I do like tech, but I don't want to be the guy that drives around with, I fix your computers in the back of my car, right? That's just not me, right? I want to be on the enterprise level. I want to be more proactive. I want to be in cybersecurity, stuff like that. So I got connected with CMIT, and they were like, hey, we have kind of a franchise model where you run the whole state of Nevada. This is your territory. So anything that happens in Nevada, you are the main guy that we go to. I was like, that sounds like a great opportunity, right? So got connected with them, and it's been a great ride with them, learning the processes. Again, it's your own business. You have the payroll, you have employees, you have all this stuff, but it's fun because it's that next step, right? Kind of where, when you're on operations side, you see vendors, they're like, oh man, they're doing really good. Now the vendors, what's that next step is, kind of business ownership, right? And then something to leave back to my kids kind of scenario, something that's going to supersede me. And that's kind of that goal to where I want to be at in the future.
What are some of the differences that you've noticed as opposed to being a director versus now you're kind of managing that self business, right? Like there's obviously challenges, like you said, you're doing payroll, you're doing the whole soup to nuts, right? So it's not just like, hey, I'm the CEO or I'm kind of, directing what's going. Like you're the CFO, you're the CIO, you're the CFO, right? Like you're doing everything. So what was the challenge there? And I'm sure that it was helpful that it's kind of a franchisee, so you're not having to either figure it all out or establish a lot of that on your own, but there's still, again, that challenge of, I've got to figure all this out. So how did you go about that?
So before COVID, I started going for my MBA. So I went for my MBA in IT management, and, anyone's been through an MBA is really interesting because I think one of the things that MBAs teach you, it's like going to Harvard. Harvard doesn't teach you how to get a job. It teaches you how to run a business, how to be a business owner, how to kind of fend for yourself. So going through the MBA process was huge for me anyways, because I was able to earn, it started to open my eyes a little bit. Like, you know what? I'm more than just a project manager, more than just a director of IT. I'm more than vice president of IT. I'm learning about all this stuff. I'm developing my skill set to run an actual business, run a P&L. And again, am I doing it perfectly? Probably not, but I'm learning around as I go along the way, kind of scenario. So for me, it's just been a really, I've always had in my life, in my career wise and you'll get to this, when you get to that director and VP level, people get very territorial. It's like, hey, you know what? You wear lots of hats, but when you're in the corporate America, they don't want you to wear lots of hats. You wear one hat. That's your only hat you wear. Don't go outside of the lines or you're going to get in trouble, right? And I was really bad at that. I would cross the line. I'd be like, hey, COO, what if we bring in for Goodwill, I was like, I went to the COO one day and I was like, hey, he's a great guy. And I was like, hey, what about we bring in Google Lens? So imagine this, we're able to use Google Lens on all the articles coming in and we can understand their value before we place them on the floor. Because you could be placing a $500 shirt on the floor for $5, where we can actually mark it up for $50 and then get a little bit more. I'm not saying we market at $500, but we make a little bit more money on that. And they get territorial because they're like, you're telling me how to run my operations? You're the CIO guy. You're supposed to just tell me, fix my computers, and that's it. And it's really hard when you start to get those big roles because they don't want you to impede on their territory. So I had a really tough time with that personally, because I was like, because I want to do good for the business, right? So I've always had that business mind, not just, hey, how is my department doing? How's the overarching business doing? So for me, it was a real easy development to go into my own business, because it is that overarching, hey, I'm taking care of everything now. I understand I am the marketing guy, I'm this. But again, as we grow, we're going to have a marketing department, we're going to have sales, but that's just all part of the process as we go, right? We have to get the tech stack right, and stuff like that. And like you said, going with the franchise was interesting. I a lot of times you're like, I go to Tech Alley, it's a great event. If no one's been there, I highly recommend it. But, they have these entrepreneur startups, and these guys come in there and like, I'm a startup and I have $50,000 and I'm going to develop the next level app. The poor kid or guy or girl, whoever, proposed the $50,000 to an offshore team, develop the app, and guess what? He has no marketing skills, no sales skills, and it just dies, kind of scenario. And not saying it was a bad app, but you invested everything in there that you had, right? Imagine buying a franchise into that or something like that. So I think the franchise model is good for that. They're saying, hey, don't just spend all your money on here. We'll help you out with marketing. We'll sprinkle in some marketing. We'll also help you out with understanding what is that right thing that you're building. Now, I'm not saying in technology, it could be anything, but predominantly for me, it was technology, because they're like, hey, you know what? Because going from enterprise to small business is a different world. And that, right? It's a different, because I'm like enterprise, like I'm used to going to a data center, data rooms, and we're seeing all this stuff where you're like, this guy has this old rusty server on his server. And he's like, I think that's our server back there. And you're like, that is not your server. But you're going into those environments, you're training and teaching. So that's kind of exciting, right? Because I'm learning a little bit too, because again, the tools for SMBs are different, right? Because they don't need the heavy lifting, but they still need security, right? So that's kind of fun of it, to teaching them that security aspect of how are we keeping your stuff safe? How are we developing these kind of scenarios? So that's kind of fun in that aspect. But the franchise model was never my first intention to go after. It just kind of fell into my lap, and I said, oh, cool, let's give it a try.
And it's probably helpful too that you do have that enterprise experience for these customers, right? Like in a small, medium business, in my experience, the little that I've had is sometimes you're getting people that have they're moving up to that role, whereas they don't have that, whereas you coming, I don't want to say coming down, right? But you're coming from enterprise down to like a small, medium business, you think differently. And the couple of times that I've done a little bit of consulting on the side and helped some of these businesses out, and just the mindset of like, hey, we can do this, right? It's kind of like, your low end, your mid tier, and your high end, right? They're looking at, because they're smaller, they can't spend a lot, and they're looking at this budget friendly, like, hey, I can just go to Best Buy and buy this thing. You can, but that doesn't mean you should. And here's why. Like, you don't need to do the enterprise. We don't need to buy, a big rack with all this stuff. But hey, let's find something in the middle that's going to address your problem, but also kind of help you scale at the same time. So would you say that a lot of the enterprise experience that you've had has been very influential or beneficial in kind of what you're doing?
Oh yeah, hugely. Because again, you're coming in with that mindset, like, probably like 6% of them will never get that big, but you're coming with that mindset of like, hey, you're future-proofing this, right? You're saying, hey, as you grow, this is going to grow and develop with you. I think a lot of those is just trying to understand the SMBs, like, for them, IT, IT's always been a loss leader, right? Any company you go to, right? But like, it's even worse for them, because they're like, oh, my brother Bob or my cousin Sally, she comes and fixes my computer. And I'm like, that's great, right? But what are you doing for backup? Who's patching? Who's, and they're like, and they look at you with these deer in the headlights and they just don't know. So you're trying to explain that to them. So yeah, because you're just used to it. Because we're just used to having teams of people. That's their job, right? You have a team of people that, hey, Patch Tuesday came out. Guess what you're doing on Wednesday, right? So bringing that back to them and explaining how these processes work. How do we keep you more secure? How do we develop you into that next level is what we do.
This has been a great conversation. I found it both enjoyable, and I've got to learn a lot. Before we kind of wrap this up, is there anything that I didn't ask or anything that you've thought of that you've kind of last minute and said, hey, you know what, Manny, you didn't ask me this, but I think this is something beneficial that, would be helpful to others?
Yeah, I think one of the things that, and it was a small piece that I kind of put in there at the end there. So I did have a small piece of my career. So when I was working for Caesars Entertainment, I was there, and this was kind of a pivotal point in my career where I was the slot machine guy out there. At that time, Caesars Entertainment had a management contract with the cruise ship company. And they came to me and says, hey, we really like your work. Will you mind going working on a cruise ship? I was 28 at the time. I'm like, yeah, no kids, no wife at that time. And I went out there with no premonition, this was before bill pay. I'm writing hand checks out 6 months in advance to pay all my bills. And I got to travel the world. I went to all 7 continents, including Antarctica. I took a world cruise that started in LA and ends in New York, circumnavigated the world. And I was able to see all that place because I just took a whim and said yes for my career. And again, and my pay, to give you some perspective, was $500 a week. So I was getting paid peanuts, but you gotta think about it. They paid for your food because you were on a cruise ship. You had to sign a 6-month contract, so it's kind of scary. You're out there for 6 months. But opening your eyes up to not only looking at the paycheck out there, also looking at what is out there. And inevitably, what I didn't learn when I was out there, that's where I got my knowledge for the database stuff. I did 4 dry docks. What dry dock is when they take the whole ship and they gut it and they clean it and they replace everything in the ship. And every ship goes through this every 3 years. And I've done like 4 of those. That's where I learned my project management skills, just by being on there, because they were like, hey, we're in dry dock for 2 weeks. You guys got to build a whole new casino and you got to do this. And that's what you got to do with it. And I had to manage that, quarterback that out, and figure that out. So those skill sets, which I wasn't even planning on doing, I learned on the cruise ship. So I highly suggest anyone, don't be afraid to take those risks that may not pay a lot, but could have an upside that you just don't know about until you actually go out there and do it. So it was a great opportunity for me to learn about it. And I met my wife out there, that I'm still married to today, which was, I stopped cruising in 2009. So it's been a little bit, but, shows you my age, right?
No, that's awesome. I mean, and I think that's sometimes that we don't think about, or a lot of people may not realize. It's just sometimes it's okay to take a gamble, right? Especially early on in your career. Like later on, if you've got a family and kids, it's tougher. And that's something that I didn't do enough of early on, is take more risk and be open to more opportunities. But I was just like, no, I'm good. I'm going to kind of do this role, or I'm going to stay within, the realm of what I know. And kind of looking back now, like you said, retrospectively, it worked out, but I think I could have had different experiences like you, like traveling the world, or just developed other skills that, I don't have now.
Yeah. And I think the biggest one, I was reading about, what's her name? Trump's new press secretary. They were talking about her background. It's kind of interesting. She did an internship at Fox 5 News and was a reporter, and took a gamble on just becoming the press secretary reporter. And next thing you know, she's the Secretary of State. It's just, these things don't happen for a reason. You have to set yourself up to kind of align your life with them, but they will fall in place. And you have to trust the process. I know when you're young, you want it all, you want it now, you want it yesterday, but just trust the process that it'll actually happen and just kind of develop as you go through.
Got it. Well, again, thank you for coming on and kind of sharing your trajectory and your experiences. It's been a blast.
Absolutely. Thanks, man.
Thanks.